is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
The Benin Bronzes, arguably some of Africa's prized treasures, looted by European colonial powers from the Benin Kingdom in southern Nigeria, have begun their long journey back home. Germany recently returned two of the priceless artifacts known as the Benin Bronzes to Nigeria after reaching a political agreement that could see the return of some 1,100 Benin Bronzes currently in Germany's museums. It will be the single largest repatriation of stolen African artifacts so far. France, also in November of 2021, returned 26 treasures that were looted from Benin, fulfilling a promise made by President Emmanuel Macron to restore a lost part of Africa's heritage. Britain, Belgium and the Netherlands have also received requests from African countries to return looted treasures. And last year, Nigeria requested its antiquities back from the British Museum in London, which has some 900 Benin Bronzes in its collections. The requests for repatriation dates back to independence in the 1960s, but they have been ignored and denied for decades. So are they finally being heard? And could this be a start of a process that could see the return of the remaining looted artifacts? We will find out in this week's program. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, joining me now is Professor Abba Issa Tijani, the Director, Nigeria Commission for Museums and Monuments. He's joining us from Abuja. Thank you, Professor Tijani, for joining us on the program. Now, Germany earlier this year signed an agreement to hand over the ownership of the historical Benin Bronzes to Nigeria. Do help us understand the political agreement between Germany and Nigeria that could soon see hundreds more artifacts return to Nigeria.
Yes, Nigeria and Germany signed a political agreement for the return of 1,130 Benin Bronzes. And at present, we have been signing the agreement for the physical return of the objects with the regional museums. And we have done that so far with some of the regional museums for the return of the objects, yes.
But we do understand that so far only two of the renowned artifacts were given back to Nigeria. And you talk about, some 1,130 should be given to Nigeria. I mean, why only two at this point? What is the future plan?
Well, the idea of the two Benin Bronzes that were actually handed over to Nigeria is just symbolic, because at the signing of the agreement, the two objects were symbolically handed over to us to take with us back to Nigeria. But of course, after signing the agreement, there is the need also to prepare these objects, pack them and package them, and then ship them to Nigeria. And we are planning to do that in phases, not because we don't want them to return all at the same time, but because of the security implications and also the condition of the objects, we need to do them in phases. So we are planning for more returns before the end of the year. At least, a couple of objects will return before the end of the year.
Right. This must be a very interesting and exciting time, for Nigeria. What is the significance of the art and the importance particularly of its return?
The significance of this Benin Bronzes to Nigeria is that we are having our objects back which were illegally taken out of Nigeria. And it shows also on the side of those that are returning these objects, particularly, for example, Germany, that they are doing the right thing. Nigeria, was not a colony of Germany, yet Germany that purchased these objects in the open market is now ready to return these objects back to Nigeria, shows that the keeping of these objects that are stolen is unethical and immoral, and therefore Germany is taking the step to show the whole world that these objects need to be returned to Nigeria. And we equally call on other countries to take leave from Germany so that all the Benin Bronzes that are part of the 1897 loot should be returned to Nigeria.
Well, there's always been a question, Professor Tijani, about what actually would happen to the artifacts when they arrive in Africa. European countries have previously, argued that African countries do not have adequate storage for the artifacts as one of the reasons for holding on to the African artifacts. Where will the art be stored once in Nigeria? And does the government have the capacity for adequate and protected storage?
Well, that's the excuses given by many museums across the world in order to not to return objects that have been illegally taken out of their countries of origin. We do have the capacity. Nigeria, for example, we have 53 national museums spread across the country. And we are also building new museums. And I'm speaking to you now, we have plans to build additional storage facilities that will house these objects when they are returned, and new galleries also to exhibit these objects. So we do have the capacity and we do have the space, and that should not be an excuse. And of course, many of these countries are also willing to support our staff here in the museums in areas of capacity building, in areas of also collaborative research and digitization of our objects. So definitely many museums are willing to do that. So we have the facilities, we have the space to do that. And let me say that also these objects have been here in Nigeria before they were stolen. So they have been here for many years, decades, and they survived all different conditions, and they have been here. So why will it be now that people will say we don't have the capacity? We cherish our cultural heritage, we love our artifacts, and definitely we will provide all the facilities that is required for the storage and exhibition of these artifacts.
So have the European museums, though, talked about being willing to assist in maybe construction of museums for the artifacts, for instance?
Well, there are many, museums in Europe that are willing to raise funds for, to support the putting in place of infrastructure for museums and exhibition areas. And we are also collaborating with such museums, and we look forward because it's the right thing to do, because after having these objects for decades in their countries, in their possessions, and I think it is right for them to support us, also build our capacity, build our infrastructure, instead of saying that we don't have such facilities. And I think it's a collaborative thing. Museums of today are global institutions, and there's no way that museums will exist on their own. So there is the need for these collaborative efforts, and we look forward to any support from different museums and different countries. And definitely, it's a mutual thing.
So I want to go back very briefly on the agreement that Nigeria signed with Germany, because the deal will also see almost a third of the artifacts remaining in German museums on loan, while the rest will be returned to Nigeria starting later in the year. What does it mean to be on loan?
You see, these artifacts have been away in Nigeria for decades, in those countries, in those museums. And we have a lot of Africans, a lot of Nigerians that are in those countries as well. So we are saying that, if these artifacts will be returned to Nigeria, of course, if all of them will return to Nigeria, of course, we are creating a vacuum as well. What about the Nigerians and other African countries, and even the Europeans that are really, supporting us, supporting our cultural heritage, that will love to see these objects and would love to be visiting museums to see these objects. And we thought that it's a good idea for these objects, some of them, to remain in those countries, in those museums, so that they can be ambassadors of Nigeria, so that our people in those countries will also have some kind of sense of belongings to see that these objects are there for them to see and appreciate, and their children that are growing up, they can go to these museums and see all these objects are from our country. So I think it's good to have some of these objects on display there. But I think the question of saying that a third of the, of the total number are going to remain is not true. We are the one to determine how many objects are going to remain, and just a small percentage of the number that will remain in those museums on loan. And at any point in time we can have those objects back. And this is not something new. That is what museums have been doing. And of course, even at present, we have so many objects on loan in many museums across the world. And there are also objects that are being committed for traveling exhibition with other countries as well. So this is a global practice of museums across the world. So it's not something new to give objects on loan. And I think I need us to understand that.
All right, because we're seeing a lot of the effort now getting fruit after over 100 years of trying to get the bronzes back to the continent. And you have personal experience here, because in 2021, you did help negotiate the return of Benin Bronzes from two British universities, the University of Aberdeen and Jesus College in Cambridge. Tell us about your process. What was it like? Did you meet much objection? How did you make much progress on that?
It's not just the National Commission for Museums and Monuments or just Nigeria, but I think it's a global effort, because there are a lot of things that play a role in this context, because there's the role of the social media as well. There is also a campaign by many Africans across the world, to see that African objects are returned to Africa. And of course, there are a lot of also people in those countries, citizens of those countries, that see that their countries and their museums should return objects that have been stolen in Africa. Professional touch is also there to show that institutions like museums that are professional institutions need to play and stay within the ethics of the profession. And I think it's ethical for them to collect things that are right and display things that are right. So anything that is illegally collected and in the possession of museums is unethical, and therefore it should not be displayed. And I think this played a very important role in this. And I think all these aspects play this role, and I think our approach also to negotiate for mutual benefit, for collaborative benefit, and to also to continue to partner in research and joint exhibition and traveling exhibitions also played a role, because most of these museums that have large collections of these looted objects keep them in the storage, and therefore only few objects are on display. So if these objects should return to us, and we will give some of them on loan, just they will not miss anything, because these few will now remain on exhibition, and they will not be able to have this protest from different parts of the communities that they are keeping objects against the will of those countries that are illegally possessed. So now they have the moral latitude to display these objects that are legally on loan.
And so many across the continent are now wondering what is next. Is this the beginning of the return of all stolen artifacts to the continent? Because Nigeria has also requested other antiquities back from the museum, from the British Museum, for instance, in London. And it has about 900 Benin bronzes in its collection. What is the progress on that request, and what next?
Well, we are making effort. We have given, a formal letter to the British Museum trustees, and they are looking at our request. And I think the British Museum, even though there is an act of parliament of the British Museum that is stopping them from repatriating, I think they have now reached the boundary now to sort of assess their own position and see that they start negotiating with us for the return of these objects, because many of the museums across the world are doing it, and the British Museum cannot be on its own. Even some museums in Britain are returning, the looted objects. So therefore, the British Museum, I think, will follow suit. It's just a matter of time. I think we'll see in the next few months what they will say as well.
Professor Tijani, thank you very much. We're now going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll be joined by a panel of experts to further expound on this issue. Stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's continue with our discussions. Joining us from Benin City, Professor Osahieme Osadulo, Professor of History and International Studies and Diplomacy at the University of Benin. From Berlin, Professor Benedicte Savoy, Professor of Modern Art History at the Technical University of Berlin, joining us there from Germany. To you both, thank you very much for joining in this discussion, and a very warm welcome to you. Professor Osadulo, let me start off with you, because this must be quite a moment for you. You know, after over 100 years, you're finally witnessing the beginning of the return of the Benin Bronzes to Nigeria. Do you think institutions should continue displaying these artifacts in their museums?
The artifacts do not belong to them. They belong to other cultures of the world. And therefore, the manner in which they were acquired, it's such that they cannot continue to keep what was looted as a result of colonial violence on African people. Secondly, they too agree that some of these artifacts that we are talking about today were acquired in the art market. And the art market is a free market for everyone to go and make purchases of artifacts, great objects of civilization. The ones that were acquired from the art market, which were not looted, they can return. But the ones that were looted, were stolen as a result of colonial injustice, and then displayed in art markets, and then from there displayed in museums, should be returned back to the original owners. That's our position. We stand by this position on the ground that whatever legal framework the museums in Europe have to evolve to return them, they do that as quickly as possible. But they complicate the issue by arguing that, the museums where these collections are in possession were not the ones that looted it. But they were looted in the first instance. And some of them were given as gifts. Others were sold. So what legal framework can we now look at that will be binding on the museums of Europe and North America to return the artifacts to where they belong?
Let me bring in Professor Savoy here. There are still around, according to Professor Osadulo, around 124 museums in 20 countries still holding Benin artifacts or African art. What has been the justification up until this point of holding African artifacts in European museums?
What you are asking is what's the justification now and what was the justification then? In the 19th century, when all this accumulation happened, the justification was very clear. It was like a competition between Paris, London, Brussels, Berlin. The idea was, if we get the most important collection from African artifacts, it will mean we are the most powerful colonial power. It was, museums were places of national affirmation, of imperial affirmation. Now, 100 years later, museums are not more comfortable with the idea of saying very openly, we are national places, we are imperial places. So the justification for the last few decades was, we are very open places, we are only keepers of this cultural heritage, and all these treasures belong to you, you can come and see them. And now we have the situation that, first of all, it is obvious that they are not open for everybody because of the very restrictive visa politic from Europe. The first affirmation, we are open to everybody, is a lie right now. And the second lie is, I think these institutions are still national and are still saying something like, we are very powerful.
Should institutions still continue, though, displaying these artifacts? And how should the returning process be? Should all the African artifacts be returned from European museums?
The first thing for me would be to say repatriation or restitution must be, like you said, also the restitution of knowledge. It's not only about the restitution of things from A to B, it's about, yes, remembering what happened. And that's very important in order to build our future. It's not about the past, it's about the future. Are museums the only places to keep these objects properly? No, museums are one option, but a very important option in Europe, but even more in Africa. And we have now in Nigeria, in Senegal, in Benin, in Congo, République démocratique du Congo, very modern museums. And these museums are one option. And your question, shall we in Europe display these objects or not? For me, the answer is very clear. If the producers of these objects are the owners, they can lend objects to Europe. Why not? It's very normal in the modern museum world. But the decision, who decide what to show, should be, yes, in the hands of the owners. It's very important for Cotonou, for example, to be able to say, okay, we have now a huge collection, a very important collection in Cotonou, in the Republic of Benin, but we are okay with the idea of giving something for 1 month to Paris or to New York. It's okay.
All right. Professor Osadulo, the debt is higher than just an economic value. You cannot put an economic, token on the cultural artifacts. Your thoughts?
The artifacts have generated revenue to these museums and to these nations. So we are saying you have stolen our artifacts for the purpose of enhancing your economy in Europe through the display on museums, and therefore will be compensated for that purpose. That is our point. It will be difficult to assess the amount of money that will be paid for what was looted hundreds of years ago. These are of immense value. Let's take some artifacts of Benin. A particular piece will stand at $10 million US. And by implication, it means that the value attached to it will be the value of compensation paid to the owners of those artifacts. That is our position. And we insist that European museums should pay compensation to the owners of those artifacts, particularly the Benin sculptures.
Professor Savoy, this is a rather interesting point of view here, but it does seem like the museums have benefited immensely over the last century.
The economical value is very obvious. In Europe, you have cities building museums only to attract tourism, like in Bilbao with the Guggenheim Museum. It's very European, and now we have maybe the same in African countries, like in Cotonou in the Republic of Benin, because the president there, Patrice Talon, is saying, okay, we need museums in order to attract tourism. It's not only about real capital, but also about symbolical capital. When the European states accumulated so much treasures from Africa, it was not only in order to make money, because the holding of these artifacts is also, you have to pay for conservation, etc. It's also a cost, if you want. But it was much more, I think, symbolical capital, like we are big, we have big collections, we are sitting of them. You know, in German, the foundation for the cultural heritage in Prussia is called Preußischer Kulturbesitz, It's like sitting. We are sitting on Africa. We are sitting on China. That's our position. And I think it's much more than only an economical field. It's a very symbolical field, and it's about power. And that's the reason why restitutions, all the discussion, not only the restitution from A to B, but all our discussion, all our negotiations are so important, because the point is, I think, for me, from my perspective as a French person in Germany, for people who are keen on,
Right.
who are supporters of restitutions, is to say European museums, the governments here, the people here must be able to let go, to open their hands, to let flow, and to recognize
Right.
that we don't want to have this situation for the 21st century.
Okay, I'm going to get your final winding up comments, and I do want to start off with you, Professor Osadulo, as you give us your closing remarks. My question here to you, though, is removing the artifacts from exhibitions, as we have discussed, or returning a piecemeal number to Africa. Is that enough, do you think? Is the job now done? Are we finally seeing the start of a process that could return all of Africa's artifacts to the continent?
First, the return of the artifacts in piecemeal will be determined by the conditions in which the various museums holding these artifacts will agree by legal framework to return them to an authority. For example, the German authority responsible for cultural affairs, to then hand over to the authorities in Nigeria, and then authorities in other countries that will now hand over to the appropriate owners of these artifacts. That is one aspect. And a second aspect is that working out the legal framework for the return of these artifacts, it may cause a lot of delay. Delay arising from understanding what should be the content and the context of the legal framework for the return of these artifacts. All of this may result in piecemeal return. However, what is important here is that all of those artifacts should be returned. In future, like the Professor Savor said, in future, when the objects are back to Europe, they will be returned because the owners want their heritage to be in world museums. That would be a different story entirely. The history will be different from what is told now about those artifacts. So that is the point that should be made. While returning them, European museums and national governments should also accompany the return with restitution, with huge payments for damages done to the peoples of Africa.
Professor Savoy, your thoughts?
You know, in Paris, if you want something from Rome, if the Louvre want Leonardo da Vinci from Rome, the Vatican will say, okay, you can have my Leonardo, but in 2 years, I want to have a Picasso from you. And if Nigeria has huge collections now, or Benin, etc., there we will be able to play this huge game. And that's very important. The monopoly of circulation and the monopoly of display should not be in the hands of European powers. For me, it's very normal. It's not revolutionary. It's obvious.
All right. Thank you both so much for a lively discussion. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our panel of experts in Benin City, Professor Osahimieni Osadulo, Professor of History and International Studies and Diplomacy at the University of Benin. And joining us from Berlin, Professor Benedict Savoy, Professor of Modern Art History at the Technical University of Berlin in Germany. Well, remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and Twitter, and you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. Bye-bye.